But here we're going to talk about marijuana, maternal marijuana use. Okay? So today we're going to talk about the prevalence of maternal marijuana use, neurobehavioral deficits, newborns, preschoolers, adolescents. We'll get to testing Meconium, and then we'll look at some results before and after a major legislation went through a year or two ago. So, November 2012, Colorado passed one of the most liberal cannabis laws in recent history in the United States. Went into effect in January 2014. Okay? Now, the law was more liberal than anything Amsterdam ever had, and they've tightened their stuff up. So this is a brand new world out there. It allows for the full commercial and distribution of marijuana within the state of Colorado. And that's a big deal because that has created an open business environment. One of the things that we're having to deal with now is the fact that weed today is not the weed that we all went to college with. Well, maybe you younger people. But this stuff is many times more stronger than what they would call ditch weed now, which was good stuff back when I was in college. And it went into effect in January of 2014. And at this time, there's a really cool website. It's really small down here. The National Alliance for the Model State Drug Laws. Okay? And they're kind of keeping track of who has recreational laws and medicinal marijuana laws. And they're keeping that track, and they got these cool little graphs. And so they're really easy to pull down and throw on a PowerPoint. So I like that website. But as you can see, medicinal marijuana, good Lord, it's all over the country now. And if it's not in some facet for marijuana, it's going to have a die-off. And if they don't have it, it's pending. The one with the little hashes are pending. Okay? And then for full-blown recreational, of course, you know, we've got to Washington, Oregon, and Colorado, but Alaska and Hawaii, Alaska, I hadn't really thought about that one, but yeah, they passed a rule too. And then all of these other states have different legislation elements pending. The legislations are different, and when you start looking at the results of the effects statistically, there's a number of items that do affect the outcome, such as, does the law allow for home cultivation? Does the law provide for and protection of dispensaries? And so those elements and how they're dealt with does create a large variance of the effects of these laws on the population as far as the public health view. But you know, everyone is talking about, you know, don't mess with me, man. I want my weed. You can't tell me I can't have my weed. If I want to smoke weed, get out of my face. All right? I understand that. I'm sort of libertarian myself. I dig that. And, you know, what you do on your time is none of my business. But from a public health concern, we have to be concerned about a number of other things than me. And so there's a number of people that are looking at the question of, how does the passage of these laws affect adolescent drug initiation? How does that affect that? They've studied that. And apparently for adolescents, it's not that big of a deal. For adults, it is. Well, is it because these people like to smoke weed anyway and they passed a law, or is it because the law was passed and now they started smoking weed? It's probably a little bit of both. People look at the crime. What's the crime rate in these areas where they have dispensaries? So they study this. They study that. They study traffic accidents. They study traffic deaths. And so you've got all of these studies going on, but I hear a big void in how does it affect maternal use? Nobody's talking about this. I've not seen any papers discussing the effect of passing these laws and the effect they have on maternal use. And so we're going to take a look today at my perspective of this issue, and I hope to bring to light a few facts. So the first question we need was how many women that are pregnant do smoke weed? All right. The National Survey on Drug Use and Health. Okay, now this is a big survey conducted under SAMHSA. They have another group, the something or other, statistical, behavioral quality or something. It's a long alphabet thing of letters. But they conduct this thing periodically. It's annually, biannually, something like that. All right? 67,000 respondents. It's a huge survey. So it's a huge database. This data is free to download. You go to the SAMHSA website, it'll lead you to it. You can pull it down, throw it in SPSS, and ask whatever questions you want to. Okay? But what they have found is during the term, and this is collating 2002 to 2008, 2.8% of the women in this survey, nationwide, self-reported the use of marijuana during the pregnancy. Now, if they self-reported that, we know the actual number is somewhere north of this. So keep that in mind with the self-reports. We know that they're underreporting. And that goes for alcohol and drug use both. The Pregnancy Risk Assessment Monitoring System. Anybody heard of this? Show of hands. This is a big survey that's conducted by the CDC each year, or every other year. And the CDC pawns off the duty to each state that chooses to participate, and they throw in some financial candy to make it happen. But what they do is they come in and they telephone interview women after they give birth. And so the feeling is that a year or so following the birth, the baby's okay, he didn't pass away, or there's no, gross deformations of the child. The feeling is that the mom will be more truthful about her nutrient and drug and alcohol use during pregnancy. So this is where this data comes from. Now, Hawaii, a couple of years ago, this is 2009 to 2011, they added some specific questions to their local module about did they use marijuana during pregnancy. And what they found was 2.6% self-reported using marijuana during their pregnancy. Now, France has a national healthcare system, and so one of the advantages of it is that you have a collective database that epidemiologists can pull from. And so what they did was they actually pulled 30 days of births throughout the whole nation of France. They found 1.2%. At our laboratory, we test the meconium of high-risk pregnancies. High risk meaning that mom had a previous history. Mom shows up stoned at the hospital. Dad shows up stoned at the hospital. Baby goes through obvious withdrawal symptoms. Baby's admitted to neonatal intensive care. So there's 7 to 9 of these red flags that categorize the birth as a high-risk pregnancy. Now, of the meconium that we do, and the meconium only looks at the last half of the pregnancy, and of course it's weighted to the birth end and the mid end, we have a 20.9%. And we've seen that number for years and years. You go anywhere from 18 to 22%, 24% on the highest, I believe. But somewhere in the 20% range is what we see day in and day out. Now that we know how many people are using it, and we have these regulations that's going into effect, now, so what? 2% use it. We have medical marijuana. It's medical. It's medicine. Must be good for you. And so there's no connotation that this stuff might be doing damage to the baby. So the people that are pro-marijuana like to show you this kind of data. What we're going to look at is the neonatal outcomes. What's going on with the baby at the time that he's born. Okay? And if we look at low birth weight as a proxy for something bad going on, you see that there's a difference between exposed and unexposed. But if you notice the 95% confidence interval here, it includes 1.0. Also, the p-value is greater than 0.05. So even though we do observe this, it's not statistically significant. And these were large studies out of Ontario, Boston, Cleveland, and one other that's escaping my mind right now. But there were some large studies back in the, starting in the late 70s and going through the early part of this century. So NICU admissions. Again, we see an increase, but again, that includes Unity. and that's greater than 0.05. So again, a statistically insignificant observation. The APGAR score, same thing. The umbilical cord artery blood pH. And then they made a composite score of these. And again, we observe a difference with the exposed and unobserved, but again, it contains unity and it is not statistically significant. So, the normal crowd says, see, weed doesn't do any damage to the baby. Don't worry about it. But they're looking at the wrong thing. You have to look at what's going to happen downstream from neonatal outcomes. And that's neurobehavioral deficits. So what in the world is that? We're talking about exposure to a foreign agent. We're all used to talking about alcohol as a teratogen, but marijuana is too, we'll see. And it has an impact on the central nervous system, and that damage has long-lasting effects. And some of those effects are behavioral impairments. Well, we're a social animal, so if you've got behavioral problems, you're going to have difficulty going down the road. So one of those things that you see in youngsters is that, and it's a clue to something that's damaged and that there's going to be some sort of issue downstream, and that's the tremors. And if you see a little video of a baby having a tremor, you'll see his little hands doing like this or his jaw vibrating. And they do it much more frequently than a child that was not exposed, and you can see that here. And this was statistically significant. Another one is startles. The little babies are born with a primitive neurological system, but they are organized. They have things organized, and they have to self-organize because now they're outside in the womb. You've got light and sound and heat and cold and all of these things coming at them, and they have to figure these things out. It's kind of like the blind man that all of a sudden sees. It's like, oh my God, what is that? Well, that's what these newborns are going through. So they have to cope with that. And one of the things that they do, well, they have a startle response. And if you watch a video of the startle test, you'll see a normal baby kind of do this and then go back to sleep. But one of these exposed kids will have an exaggerated startle where they freak out for a long period of time before they can calm themselves back down. And so this is a sign that something ain't quite right there. All right? If you smoke weed, you'll have ugly babies. Kidding. We can look at neurobehavioral deficits by looking at the EEG. There's a lot going on in sleep. Little babies spend a lot of energy sleeping. I heard that for the first time, and that sounded weird. But one of the things, and when you sleep, there's a lot of things going on. And the baby's going through a lot of new stuff at the very beginning. And so he needs that sleep, and he needs good sleep. And what they're finding out is that there's a big difference between the exposed kids and the unexposed kids. Active sleep is less, movements are up, REM is way down, and all of those findings are statistically significant. Okay? Then we get a little older, 3 years old. Big study, 655. This is the guy that invented the IQ test, one of these two guys. But the pieces that we're looking at here, verbal reasoning, abstract visual reasoning, quantitative reasoning, short-term memory of a 3-year-old. And when you look at exposed versus unexposed, per points per joint per day, you have a -7 and a -2. Again, statistically significant. Now this is at a time when the kid is like entering preschool. So he's trying to learn his alphabet and his numbers and all of that. Uh-oh. We're setting him up for a long-term failure. Then we move up into the teen years. And according to this instrument it's a self-reported delinquency, the kids that were exposed, odds ratio is 1.84, again statistically significant, that these kids will exhibit delinquent behaviors in their teen years. And these were at 14. So I remember how rough it was for me at 14, and I know my mom didn't smoke weed. But just imagine if you're 14 and you got all these other things going on and your hormones are going crazy and it's a tough time already. Why make it tougher? And also the maternal marijuana use predicts use as a young adult. Again, odds ratio 1.28, statistically significant finding. It cycles back around. So now you've got somebody smoking weed, they're in the reproductive age. So what's Meconium? How many people have worked with Meconium? Raise a hand. Oh, more than I thought. Good. So we know it's the first little poo that a baby takes. And this is a sample size that, we asked for this at our lab. This is about 2 grams here. And we did the plastic spoon and to make it look more appetizing. But it's a complicated mixture. There's lots of stuff in there. And these components vary widely, which make it a very difficult substance to work with. It's a very difficult, it's an easy test to do poorly. It's a very difficult test to do well. And it has to do with the variance of all of these components and making it difficult to extract consistently. But it has a lot of advantages. Easier to collect than urine. If you've ever tried to collect the baby urine, it's awful. Concentrations are similar to urine, so those doing workplace drug testing, those numbers, well, you can achieve this on your equipment, so that was a big deal back in the 90s when this was getting started. Long window of detection. It's stable because it's kind of protected and bound to proteins in there. And it's been the accepted standard now for about 25 years. Standard procedure here, you have to homogenize it. Obviously, you can't pour it in the tube. You hydrolyze it. It's a glucuronide primarily. Liquid extraction, hexane ethyl acetate. We derivatize it with MTB STFA, so we get a little further downstream, away from a lot of the other junk, get a little heavier molecular weight. And just a plain old 5971, this is the one that my boss started his lab with back in 1991. The only part that's original to it is the serial number plate on the back. It's kind of like the Johnny Cash Cadillac, right? DB5 column, I'm sure you guys have one in your area, and standard ions, I'm sure you're all familiar with all of that. So, for all of you budding lab managers, I can't tell you how important it is to surround yourself with people smarter than yourself. And because they make you look good. So, I didn't come up with this topic. One of the ladies in the laboratory, we were kind of just chatting around the Colorado thing and blah, blah, blah. And one of them said, and I don't know if it was Irene who's sitting there or if it was Eileen or Eileen, you get them mixed up. But one of them said, gee, I wonder what the marijuana rates from Colorado look like. It was just like, yeah, blah, 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 toss it away, not a problem. And several months later, as I was trying to come up with a poster idea for a conference last summer, that came to me. And I said, hey, let's look at that. So, we queried our database. We do over 1,000 Meconium a month. And we looked at all the Meconium that originated in the state of Colorado. I only did the first 3 quarters of 2012 and 2014. Now keep in mind that the law went into effect January 2014. But we had a couple of large clients out of Colorado switch from Meconium to umbilical cord tissue. And so that kind of threw my numbers off. So I stuck with the first 3 quarters. It was plenty of samples. I evaluated the positivity rates and I evaluated the concentrations because I know that the weed is getting more potent over time. This is what we found. Now this chart makes it look good and I put it in red so everybody go, oh my God, look at this. But it did go up. And when you compared it to the national rate did not go up statistically significant. This was a statistical significant increase. Okay? But that's not as impressive as the next slide, where I'm looking at the concentrations that we found across the U.S. versus the concentrations that we found in Colorado. And in 2014, look at this. This is a box and whisker, so this is the median, and these are the quartiles. This fourth quartile is totally above everything else. And so not only are we seeing more babies exposed to marijuana in Colorado, man, they're being exposed to a whole lot more. And this procedure has not changed during that period of time. And so what does this mean? What's going to happen? We don't know. All of these studies that I referred to earlier, this was back in the 80s and 90s. But now we've got this new stuff that we have to deal with. So I had some obvious limitations. I had no control over the selection. You know, the hospitals do what they do. I can't tell them what to do. I was limited in my time frame because I did have some large clients shift their testing patterns. No control over the collection procedure. I have to assume that they're following the same collection procedure throughout their same time. And this does not prove causation. This was a snapshot. It's a cross-sectional analysis. Although it does fit certain elements of the points you need to prove in causation, but it certainly does not prove causation. So in summary, the social norms are relaxing concerning weed. We do observe neurobehavioral deficits, and those observations are statistically significant. Prevalence was slightly higher. Meconium concentrations were much higher. And the effects of this exposure at this point is largely unknown. And so with that, thank you.